I was on my phone the other night, just scrolling. You know how it is. And I started to pay attention to what was being fed to me, almost like a pattern. First, a headline. This person's career is over. I scrolled. Next, a clip. You won't believe this insane opinion. Scrolled again. Why? Everyone hates this thing you probably like. And I felt this pressure, this low-grade, constant hum of manufactured anger. It wasn't information. It wasn't connection. It felt like I was being, well, farmed for a reaction. It shot me back to a memory of an old blog I had back in maybe 2006. It was mostly just me, a college kid, trying to be a musician, posting these earnest, honestly kind of cringy entries about my life. But I remembered the comments, someone from a different country talking about their band, someone else giving actual thoughtful feedback. It was a conversation. And I'm just sitting there looking at this bright, angry feed on my phone and then thinking about that quiet, authentic little corner of the web. It felt like looking at two completely different planets. And the question that just hits you right in the chest is, how in the world did we get from that to this? Welcome to the deep dive. That question, that huge gap between the early kind of open web and the system we have now, this engineered compulsion. That's really our core mission today. We're going deep into the forces that shape this whole modern digital experience. Specifically, this pervasive influence of what some people are calling addictive design. But importantly, we're not just stopping at the diagnosis. We refuse to do that. We're going to contrast this manufactured environment with some really concrete, successful grassroots movements and new design ideas too. Paradigms that are actively working to reclaim that digital space, prioritizing well-being, authenticity, real-world community impact over just raw engagement numbers. This is the great divide we're talking about. And we're going to unpack the forces that created it and maybe, just maybe, the strategies that can start to close it.
Yeah, that contrast you felt, it's not an accident. Not at all. It's systemic. The whole architecture of the modern internet, it's built on this fundamental priority of the attention economy, which is basically capturing and monetizing every second of your available brain space. The focus shifted entirely. It went from, helping people communicate to engineering compulsion. It's a huge shift.
Right.
And that shift you described, that feeling, it's a direct result of putting maximizing screen time way above user autonomy. Researchers are now really trying to tackle this. They're advocating for prioritizing digital well-being right from the start in the design process itself, because they recognize that current systems, they rely heavily on what they're calling attention capture deceptive designs, ECDPs for short.
ECDPs.
Yeah, these are specific design patterns. They're engineered really to erode your sense of self-control. They do it by removing natural stopping cues and exploiting cognitive biases we all have.
Okay, let's really dig into that. The toolkit of compulsion, you called it. We all feel that pull, right? But I think it helps to actually name the specific mechanisms, the things overriding our own intentions. So what are these concrete patterns, the ones used to keep us hooked?
Well, the first one, and maybe the most insidious, just because it's so seamless, it's infinite scroll.
Ah, yes. The endless feed.
Exactly. Think of any major feed you use, Facebook, Instagram, X, whatever. You never actually hit the bottom, right?
Nope, never.
So this feature, it removes those natural stopping points, things we're used to in the physical world, like reaching the end of a page in a book.
Or finishing a tape back in the day.
Right. We're finishing a magazine article.
Yeah.
By getting rid of pagination, page numbers, clicking next, the design creates this psychological illusion, the illusion that new, exciting content is just going to flow forever. It's like an endless path designed to keep that reward loop constantly open in your brain.
So, okay, instead of finishing something like a task and then making a conscious choice, okay, what next? You're just kind of stuck in this continuous loop of low-effort consumption. You're always sort of searching for that next little dopamine hit, that minor reward, but you never actually reach closure. Is that it?
That's exactly it. And closely related to that continuous flow is never-ending autoplay.
Oh, yeah. The bane of my existence sometimes.
Right. You finish one video, maybe on YouTube or somewhere else, and boom, the next one just starts automatically. Often it's related to what you just watched, but the key is it happens without you lifting a finger. This is a very deliberate design choice. It undermines user intention. You might have only meant to watch, say, 5 minutes of content. But by automating the next session, the platform removes even that tiny bit of effort required to quit. It basically leverages your own inertia against your self-control.
Inertia against self-control. That's a good way to put it.
Then you've got the content drivers themselves, the stuff they actually show you. Let's call them guilty pleasure recommendations.
Guilty pleasures. Okay. Like what?
Well, these are those viral suggestions. They're tailored purely to increase your time on the site, not necessarily content that aligns with your long-term goals or, positive aspirations. The algorithm pushes stuff that's highly emotionally potent. Often it's sensational, divisive, or focused on outrage.
Yeah, the angry stuff you mentioned at the start.
Exactly, because the platform knows that generates the quickest, the deepest, and the most reliable form of engagement. It doesn't really matter what the emotional cost is to you, the user. It just works to keep eyes on screens.
It really sounds like the algorithm's main job is just finding the most efficient way to keep us glued, even if that way involves making us kind of angry or envious or outraged. And then, okay, so let's say you do manage to break free, you put the phone down.
Yeah.
But then there's the system designed specifically to pull you right back in, isn't there?
Oh, absolutely. Those are the recapture notifications.
The pings, the buzzes.
Yep. Those little alerts. System notifications designed specifically to trigger a new session. And critically, they're often staggered or timed based on predictive models. Why? To create a feeling of variable, unpredictable reward.
Variable reward.
Yes, this is a direct borrowing from mechanisms we've known about for ages, from operant conditioning, specifically that variable reward schedule used in slot machines.
Wow.
You get rewarded sporadically, unpredictably, and that unpredictability is what fosters the deepest level of compulsion. It keeps you checking, hoping for that next hit.
Okay, yeah, that makes the comparison to a casino feel much, much less like an exaggeration. The design is literally borrowing from the psychology of gambling addiction.
Yeah.
But okay, if designers have this powerful toolkit for, well, compulsion, they need an equally robust toolkit for wellness, right? If we actually want platforms to shift their priorities, what do these counter patterns look like? The healthy alternatives.
Yeah, absolutely. And as they're being developed, they're encapsulated in new conceptual tools, things like the digital well-being lens tool. It's designed for platforms designers use, like Figma. And the whole idea is to guide designers to actively promote user autonomy and, frankly, respect their time. So for every damaging ACDP we just talked about, there's a proposed positive alternative, one designed to put the user back in the driver's seat.
Okay, so give us some examples. What's the antidote to infinite scroll?
So the alternative to infinite scroll is robust content pagination.
Pagination, like page numbers again?
Essentially, yes. Reintroducing stopping points. It requires the user to explicitly click or swipe or do something to see more content. It turns that passive, endless consumption back into an intentional choice.
Right. So instead of just drifting passively into the next hour of scrolling, you're forced, even briefly, to make a conscious decision. Okay, do I want to spend 5 more minutes here? Yes or no? But here's the elephant in the room, maybe. If infinite scroll is so incredibly effective at maximizing views and therefore ad revenue, what's the real economic cost to a platform if they switch, if they go all in on content pagination? How do they possibly balance user well-being with their obligations to shareholders who want profit?
That is the ultimate tension. You nailed it. And it's the primary reason these ACDPs are so sticky, why they persist. Platforms will argue quite strongly that these features are essential for engagement. And engagement directly translates to ad impressions, which means revenue, full stop, switching to pagination. It introduces friction. That's the point, from a well-being perspective. But from a business perspective, friction will reduce time on site for some users, no question. The underlying assumption behind something like the digital well-being lens is that platforms have to learn to compete differently. They need to compete on the quality of their content and service,
rather than just the sheer quantity of time they can steal from us.
Exactly. The thinking is, if a user spends less time on the site, but finds the experience genuinely more valuable, maybe they'll return more reliably. Maybe they'll develop deeper trust. That represents a different kind of economic model, a more sustainable one, potentially. But it's a big shift in thinking.
Okay, so pagination for infinite scroll. What about autoplay?
Similarly, for never-ending autoplay, the straightforward alternative is mandatory press to play.
Makes sense. You have to click play.
Yep. Videos only start after you explicitly interact. It seems small, but it respects attention. It also saves data, confirms you actually want to start that next session. And then instead of those problematic guilty pleasure recommendations,
right, the outrage stuff,
the suggested counter pattern is more advanced content categorization. This means organizing suggested content by specific topics the user defines, or goals they set, or categories they choose, rather than just raw virality or sensationalism. This lets users engage intentionally with content that's relevant to their actual goals, not just their fleeting impulses or, the manufactured outrage of the day. Tag 1.2 Public Health Laws Digital Frontier.
Okay, so this architecture of engineered compulsion
Yeah.
and the really clear parallel to gambling or even substance addiction, it's kind of inevitably dragged these platforms onto a legal battlefield, hasn't it?
Yeah.
What we're discussing isn't just a design choice anymore. It's being framed more and more as a massive public health concern. People are drawing parallels to historical interventions against industries like, well, tobacco or even prescription opioids.
Yeah, the legal context here is really fascinating, and it's evolving fast. The core allegation in some major lawsuits against platforms is that they knowingly, or at least negligently, constructed these digital environments that look much more like a casino.
Designed for operant conditioning.
Exactly. More like a casino than a neutral marketplace of ideas, which is often how they present themselves. And just like those historical public health interventions forced transparency and regulation on manufactured addictive products, cigarettes, opioids, this public health lens demands that platforms reveal how they tailor the timing and the nature of rewards to foster compulsion. And there's particular concern about how this targets the developing brains of kids and teens.
So the legal expectation then is that courts might actually need to step in to kind of balance the scales, given the massive information asymmetry here. You've got these trillion-dollar companies designing the systems and then the public using them, often without really understanding the manipulation involved. But platforms have a pretty formidable legal shield, don't they? What's the main defense?
They do. It's a big one. Their primary defense rests on two main pillars: Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act and the First Amendment of the U.S. Constitution. So platforms argue that any state authority trying to regulate these addictive designs is preempted, basically overruled, by federal law and the Constitution. They assert that design features like infinite scroll or how notifications work necessarily implicate expression.
Expression, how so?
Well, they argue it's the platform's choice of what to recommend, how to present it, how to facilitate user communication. And regulating the design, in their view, is therefore regulating their speech.
Wow. So they're basically arguing that their decision to implement infinite scroll, or, how they time a notification, that's part of their constitutionally protected editorial function or communicative function. That seems like a huge, almost impenetrable defense. It sounds like they're claiming that designing an addictive product online is just a public health law-free zone.
It is a very, very challenging claim to navigate legally, no doubt. But legal scholars and public health advocates are actively pushing back. They're challenging this idea of blanket immunity. Because think about it. If platforms can successfully shield any design choice with the First Amendment just because it's implicated, is there any legal strategy left for public health regulation in the digital space?
Right. It seems like the answer would be no.
Well, the answer that's emerging increasingly is yes, there might be a way. And it's through a concept called neutrality triangulation.
Neutrality triangulation. Okay, tell us more about that strategy. How does it try to regulate platform behavior without stepping on their editorial decisions about actual content?
So neutrality triangulation tries to focus regulation on platform conduct that is demonstrably content neutral. The argument is that regulating that kind of conduct might be permissible, even if decisions about moderating specific content remain protected. The key is trying to separate the platform's decision about what content to show from the platform's decision about how and when to show it.
Okay, can you give an example to make that clear?
Sure. So let's say a platform's algorithm chooses to favor one political viewpoint over another. That's pretty clearly content-based conduct, right? And Section 230 likely protects that choice.
Right, that's their editorial decision.
Exactly. However, consider the design of the notification system itself. Specifically, when it uses that variable reward schedule we talked about, the unpredictable timing, purely to maximize how often you re-engage, regardless of whether the notification is about a cute puppy video or some angry political tirade. That mechanism, the timing, the delivery system, is arguably content-neutral conduct.
I think I see. So regulating the like button itself is a tool people use to communicate approval, which is a form of speech that might be protected. But regulating the timing of the notification that tells you someone liked your post, especially when that timing is deliberately staggered to foster a compulsion response, that jackpot effect you mentioned, that might fall into this safer harbor. Because you're regulating the mechanism, the timing, the delivery, not the substance of the message itself.
Precisely. That's the core idea. This strategy is really critical because it potentially preserves a meaningful space for public health regulation. It lets regulators target the addictive mechanisms themselves, and by doing that, it allows them to target the underlying economic incentive structure. Think about it. If platforms currently compete mainly by offering more and more addictive products rather than better quality products,
Right.
then regulating those core addictive design features could help level the playing field. It could push competition towards driving quality, not just compulsion. So this legal pathway, this neutrality triangulation, it's seen as a really vital component if we want to shift the digital economy towards prioritizing well-being.
Okay, this makes sense. But before we can effectively regulate or even redesign these systems, we really have to precisely define the harm we're trying to fix, right? Experts need to move beyond just vague complaints like, social media is bad for kids. We need an actionable, almost surgical definition of the problem.
Absolutely. And that was the entire motivation behind a big workshop at Stanford focused on youth, safety, and digital well-being. They developed something called the Integrated Harm Framework, or IHF. The whole goal was to systematically define these digital problems so they can actually be measured and then hopefully mitigated. So instead of just talking about one big amorphous risk, they categorized 22 potential youth harms that they identified in scientific literature, and they grouped them into 4 clear areas.
Okay, what were these 4 actionable areas? How did they break it down?
So the 4 categories are: 1, threats to safety or criminal activity. This is the really severe stuff like child sexual abuse material, CSAM, or online grooming, adult minor solicitation.
Okay, the most serious harms.
Right. 2, health and well-being. These are harms like increased anxiety, depression, lowered self-esteem, body image issues, sleep disruption. 3, other content-driven harms. This includes things like exposure to suicide and self-harm content, or maybe extremist ideologies, or just generally hateful content.
Yeah.
And 4, other harms. This is a bit of a catch-all, but includes things like privacy violations or data misuse. Now, when the experts evaluated all 22 of these specific risks, a really core theme emerged: the need to balance severity versus prevalence.
Severity versus prevalence, meaning how bad it is versus how often it happens.
Exactly. We have to understand not just how devastating a harm is when it occurs, but also how common it is across the user population.
That distinction seems crucial. Let's change how you think about allocating resources and designing interventions. Can you give us an example?
Sure. CSAM child sexual abuse material is a classic example of high severity but relatively low prevalence. When it occurs, the damage is absolutely devastating. It demands specialized, high-intensity mitigation efforts, law enforcement involvement, etc. Conversely, think about harms like online bullying or harassment, or that feeling of upward social comparison, feeling bad comparing your life to others online.
Right. Those feel much more common.
Exactly. These are examples of high prevalence. They happen to a huge percentage of users, especially young users. But the individual severity can vary quite widely. Bullying, for instance, studies suggest it affects roughly 1 in 6 young people online. That makes it a widespread public health issue. And addressing that requires broad, maybe systemic design changes, rather than just targeted criminal interventions like with CSAM.
Okay, that makes sense. And that leads directly to another critical point discussed in the framework, right? The distinction between mechanism versus outcome. Why did the experts push back so hard against defining harms purely by their mechanism? Like, why not just say social comparison is the harm?
Because focusing only on the mechanism doesn't actually specify the negative consequence. And if you can't specify the negative consequence, it makes measuring whether your mitigation efforts are working almost impossible. Take that term, upward social comparison. As a mechanism, well, everyone engages in social comparison all the time. It's a fundamental human thing, online and off.
Right.
The harm isn't the comparison itself, it's what happens next because of the comparison. Does it lead to anxiety, depression, reduced self-esteem? If we try to regulate upward social comparison as the harm, we'd basically have to regulate almost everything that happens online. It's just too broad.
Okay. So the mechanism isn't the harm, the negative outcome is.
Precisely. So the consensus among these experts really favored specifying the outcome. They argued against these vague mechanism-only harms and instead pushed for specifying outcomes. Like, instead of just social comparison, define the harm as, quote, social comparison that results in anxiety or reduced self-esteem.
That's much more specific.
It is, because that is an actionable definition. You can actually measure self-esteem levels. You can measure anxiety levels before and after you try an intervention. If we just focus on the mechanism, we end up swinging blindly, potentially regulating things that aren't actually causing widespread harm.
So this means that other things people worry about, like algorithmic biases or even general misinformation, those were viewed maybe not as the definitive harm itself, but more as mechanisms or tools that just make other problems worse, like exacerbating anxiety or contributing to polarization and civil unrest.
That's a good way to frame it, yeah. They function as amplifiers or contributors to those more specific outcome-based harms.
Okay, so this integrated taxonomy, this framework, it provides the kind of clarity needed for regulators, platforms, maybe even parents, to stop making just vague pronouncements and start demanding specific, measurable strategies to reduce actual defined harms.
That's the goal. Clarity for action.
Okay, so the first half of our dive really showed us an internet that feels increasingly designed to, well, farm anger and addiction, as I put it earlier. Now we need to shift the lens completely. To look at a powerful counter-narrative, the big question here is, can a small group of people, maybe without huge resources, prioritize real-world impact and social change over just manufactured engagement and actually succeed? Can that model work? And the answer, it seems, comes from the really inspiring work of community content creators, CCs, in places like India.
Yes, the story of these CCs is just a perfect illustration of how digital platforms, despite everything we've discussed, can still be used as a powerful force for good. They've essentially inverted that attention economy model we talked about. They're proving that generating genuine community value can actually be more powerful in the long run than just churning out viral clickbait.
Let's start with that journey of empowerment. You mentioned Jyoti Kadam earlier. Tell us a bit more about her story. She was apparently, initially, quite apprehensive about even using Facebook back in 2012, limited her interactions just to people she knew locally.
That's right. Jyoti's transformation is really incredible, and it's representative of many others in this network. After receiving specific training in digital literacy, smartphone use for reporting, content creation, she went from being this hesitant user to becoming a really influential local voice in her area, the Marina district. She basically transformed her smartphone into an instrument for social change. She started reporting on critical community issues that were being missed by mainstream media or ignored by local authorities.
And she wasn't aiming for fame, right? The goal was different.
Exactly. She wasn't seeking likes or viral fame. She was seeking solutions for her community. Her story is just one of about 117 such CCs who've made this transition, becoming digital changemakers.
And this movement, it translates directly into measurable impact, right? Not just views or follower counts, but actual real-world change.
Absolutely. That's the crucial part. This network, which is supported by an organization called Video Volunteers, has produced something like over 18,000 videos. And these videos address a huge spectrum of local issues, everything from, broken roads and lack of water access to really serious issues of social injustice, caste discrimination, gender inequality. But the critical metric of success here is this. 30% of the specific issues they addressed saw tangible, real-world resolutions.
Wow, 40%.
Yeah. Once local government officials were alerted, often pressured by the community response generated online from these videos, things actually changed on the ground. That is the definition of content driving social justice. It's not just raising awareness, it's achieving results. And furthermore, their audience growth they tracked it over a recent one-year period from May 2023 to May 2024. It demonstrates that the public is actively seeking out this kind of authentic content, even if the big platform algorithms don't necessarily prioritize it.
What did the growth look like?
They saw this combined grassroots social media surge that's really hard to ignore. Get this, 84% subscriber growth on YouTube.
84%.
Yeah, which shows a real demand for their longer form investigative type content. Then, a 61% follower surge on Instagram, proving their visual storytelling really resonated. And even on Facebook, a platform often associated with older demographics or different content types, they saw strong 22% follower growth.
Those numbers are honestly astronomical for content that's primarily purpose-driven, not entertainment-driven. It feels like it completely debunks the pervasive idea that only outrage, division, or celebrity gossip can drive significant growth in the modern digital age.
Exactly. And when researchers dug into why this growth was happening, they synthesized it down. They identified 7 key drivers for the CC's success. And these drivers really form the core recipe for this kind of antiviral content, if you will. Content that stands in direct opposition to the standard engagement first, maximize clicks model.
Okay, I want to hear this. Lay out these 7 ingredients for us. What's the success formula?
All right. The first one, and it's probably the most foundational, is simply that authenticity matters. These creators, they share raw, real-life stories directly from their communities. often speaking from a first-person perspective or just documenting events as they happen without a lot of gloss.
Unfiltered.
Very unfiltered. And this generates a really deep level of trust and relatability, something that polished, commercially produced content just struggles to replicate. Second, they prioritize consistency over perfection.
Okay.
Instead of, say, waiting weeks to craft one potentially high-production viral hit, they focus on maintaining regular posting schedules. They show this unwavering dedication to community issues over time. They build loyalty not through momentary dazzle, but through persistently shining a light on local concerns, providing follow-up reports, sticking with a story. The third driver is a relentless focus on local matters. They're tackling really granular, grassroots issues, things that resonate deeply because they directly affect the daily lives of their audience members.
Like the broken road or the water issue.
Exactly. This positions them as almost indispensable sources of local information and advocacy. They're not just talking about abstract problems, they're talking about the community's problems and actively working towards solutions.
So they become almost like essential utilities for the community, rather than just another entertainment source.
Makes sense.
What about the interactive side? Social media is supposed to be social, right?
That's the fourth key driver: connect, engage, and interact. They actively foster two-way communication. They respond promptly to comments. They acknowledge messages. They actually incorporate audience feedback into their future reporting.
So it's a dialogue.
It's absolutely a dialogue. This cultivates a really strong, engaged community around their work. For these creators, the power of social media isn't just broadcasting a message into the void. It's about fostering genuine interaction and collaboration. Fifth, many of these creators literally be the change they want to see in their communities. Individuals like Jodi Kadam, they become these powerful local role models. They challenge restrictive gender norms just by doing the work they do. They inspire young people. They demonstrate that a single person, armed with just a smartphone and some training, can actually affect significant change in their village or district.
That's incredibly powerful. What else?
The sixth driver is their high level of integrity and responsibility in how they create content. They follow strict ethical guidelines for reporting things like fact-checking, getting consent, protecting vulnerable sources. This means their content is reliably trustworthy, which is crucial in an era of rampant misinformation. And seventh, finally, they exhibit incredible adaptability and learning. They quickly absorb the digital literacy training they receive, but then they apply it creatively to their specific community needs. They're constantly iterating, improving their content based on what works, what gets results, what resonates.
Wow, okay, those 7 points paint a really clear picture. And we see the power of this formula really clearly in the case of another creator, Renu Puri. You mentioned her earlier. How did her implementation of these principles lead to such, well, explosive growth?
Yeah, Renu Puri's story is remarkable. She joined the program, the Video Volunteers Training, with a pretty small local following, and she just diligently implemented these 7 strategies, posting daily, mixing community coverage with some personal, authentic content, really focusing on the interaction and authenticity. And her Facebook following just exploded. It went from only 45 followers to over 3,900 within just a few months.
Wait, 45 to almost 4,000?
Yep, that's an 8,567% growth rate.
That's insane.
It is. And that kind of explosive high trust growth, it just flies in the face of the conventional wisdom that says only manufactured outrage or celebrity drama can go viral. Renu Puri and others like her prove that genuine community content centered on real people and real issues can absolutely compete. It can win against the clickbait machine.
And didn't she also find that her own casual, like unfiltered personal videos got the most engagement?
She did, which just reinforces that core idea again. Authenticity is maybe the highest form of currency in this alternative digital space. It's what people crave and it's what they trust.
And trust seems to be the essential ingredient here.
It really is. And maybe one of the most striking findings from the analysis of the entire CC network was the content purity. Across thousands of posts, they found a complete absence of misinformation, hate speech, or deliberately divisive content.
Not at all.
None detected in the sample studied. By centering their content on solution-oriented community needs, they naturally filter out that manufactured anger and divisive noise that dominates so much of the attention economy. And this establishes them as these uniquely trustworthy, reliable voices for their communities in a very turbulent digital landscape. Hashtag 2.3, the influencer's dilemma.
Okay, so the success of the CCs is clearly built on trust and purpose, which provides a really stark contrast to the, let's say, mainstream commercial influencer ecosystem. That world is still largely driven by maximizing engagement, often for profit. And here, when the content shifts from maybe authentic purpose to more of a commercial transaction, we have to take a measurable downside, don't we? This reputation burning effect.
Right.
That's right. Research looking at mainstream commercial influencers found something really interesting. That decision to post sponsored content, it carries a hidden economic cost, a cost in audience trust. The audience is watching, and they are judging the creator's motivations when they see that hashtag ad or hashtag sponsored tag.
Wait, hang on. So you're telling me that posting a sponsored video actually costs them something? In trust capital, or even subscribers? That seems to contradict the entire premise of influencer marketing, which is built on leveraging trust for sales. How did researchers actually measure that reputation burning effect?
Well, they did a massive analysis, looked at thousands and thousands of YouTube videos, correlated specific content types, sponsored versus organic, with fluctuations in subscriber counts around the time of posting. And they found, controlling for other factors, that posting a sponsored video leads to an average 0.19% drop in subscriber count compared to posting an equivalent organic video from the same creator.
0.19%. Okay, that sounds small.
It sounds small, but think about scale. For a creator with, say, 10 million followers, that 0.19% drop is 19,000 lost subscribers.
Wow. Okay, that's not insignificant.
No, it's a measurable financial hit because subscriber count affects future earnings, and it's a reputational loss with every single commercial post. The interpretation is that audiences, especially loyal ones, can feel a bit betrayed, or they feel the creator's authenticity has been compromised when they push a product too hard or in a way that feels off-brand. Consumers are just increasingly wary of pure monetization efforts, especially when they perceive the content itself as maybe lacking trustworthiness or genuine enthusiasm from the creator. This finding really challenges that conventional brand assumption that just having a bigger audience automatically equals better marketing results, regardless of how often or how clumsily you try to monetize that audience.
Okay, so if you're a creator and you do need to monetize, which is fair, it's often their job. How do you mitigate this backlash? How do you avoid burning that reputation? It doesn't seem realistic to ask them to stop sponsored content entirely, but clearly they need to do it smarter.
Definitely. And the study does offer a couple of key mitigation strategies, both for brands working with influencers and for the influencers themselves. First, content alignment is absolutely crucial. Meaning the sponsored content has to closely match the influencer's typical style, their values, the topics they usually cover. If the promotion feels native, if it feels relevant, if it feels like something the creator would genuinely use or talk about anyway, the audience backlash is significantly reduced. They're more forgiving. Second, and this was a bit unexpected, brand status plays a role.
Brand status? How so?
Promotions for lesser-known or smaller brands actually result in less audience backlash than deals with huge, high-profile brands.
Huh. That is surprising. Why?
The thinking is that audiences might be particularly wary of big-name creators who appear to be purely cashing in on their fame through massive corporate deals that feel impersonal or purely transactional. Promoting a smaller, perhaps more niche brand might feel more authentic, more like a genuine discovery the creator is sharing. So the lesson is clear. Maintaining that crucial audience trust, even when monetizing, it requires a really intentional balance. It needs transparency, sure, but also a deep commitment to quality, relevance, and alignment over just the raw financial incentive.
Okay. We've diagnosed the problem, the addictive architecture. We've seen successful grassroots resistance, the community content creators. Now we have to look at how we scale the solutions. How do we rebuild a healthier digital commons? This seems to require both intentional, ethical platform design and probably some regulatory efforts that fundamentally shift the current business model towards well-being and maybe even diversity. Hashtag tag 3.1, designing for diversity and well-being.
Exactly. To really shift the digital space fundamentally, we need more than just tweaks. We need new foundational design philosophies. Philosophies that treat diversity not just as a demographic checkbox to tick, but as a core asset to be leveraged for collective benefit. One interesting conceptual framework that's exploring this is called the WeNet platform. And its whole aim is to completely overturn that traditional perspective, to shift from seeing the internet as a network of computers to seeing it as a network of people who are empowered by computers. They position the platform itself as a collectivity enabler.
A collectivity enabler. Okay, that's a powerful philosophical shift, I agree. But in practice, How do you take a concept as abstract as leveraging diversity and turn it into like actual operational platform design? How does that work?
Yeah, that's the core challenge, right? Defining diversity in a way that's actually actionable for an algorithm or a system. In this WeNet framework, the idea is to leverage diversity in two main ways. One, to allow like-minded individuals to find each other and pursue similar interests, which platforms already do to some extent. But more interestingly, two, to allow diverse individuals to complement each other in complex activities.
Right.
And to do that, they define diversity not just by static demographic attributes, age, location, gender, but by highly specific social practices.
Social practices, what does that mean?
A social practice in their model is basically a routinized type of behavior, something people do regularly. And it consists of three fundamental, potentially measurable elements. One is competence, the actual skills and technical know-how a person has related to that practice. Two is meaning, their values, the norms, the beliefs they hold surrounding that practice, why they do it, what it means to them. And three is material, the physical aspects involved, like the tools they use, the infrastructure they need, maybe even the specific physical environment where the practice takes place. The system then tries to identify users based on these diverse elements, competence meaning material, in order to match them effectively for collaboration or mutual support.
Okay, could you give us a concrete example? How does defining diversity by competence, meaning, and material actually change the matching process compared to just using demographics?
Sure. Let's take a university setting, which is the kind of environment this WeNet platform was conceptually designed for. Imagine a first-year sociology student. They're really struggling with the statistics component of their course. The platform needs to connect them with someone who can help.
Okay.
Now, if you only use demographics, you might just match them with any random older student who happens to be good at math.
Right. Might work, might not.
Exactly. But this diversity-aware system, because it understands social practices, would try to be more precise. It would look for someone who exhibits specific competence, not just in math, but in sociometry, the specific types of statistics used to measure social relationships, which is different from, say, psychometry used in psychology or the math and engineering student uses.
Ah, much more targeted.
Right. It leverages the difference between users' specific social practices so they can complement each other's skills for a very precise shared goal. It's about leveraging nuance for better collaboration.
Okay, I could definitely appreciate that level of nuance. But relying on such detailed behavioral data, these social practices, it immediately raises huge questions for me about ethical data collection and privacy, especially since you mentioned the conceptual framework adheres to strict European data protection laws like GDPR. How do they handle that?
Yeah, that is precisely why ethical data collection and strict adherence to privacy regulations like GDPR are absolutely central to the model. It has to be from the very beginning. A key part of their approach is emphasizing participatory design.
Meaning the users help design it.
Exactly. Students, in this case, wouldn't just be passive data subjects. They'd be active collaborators in the process. They'd be involved in defining their own diversity, deciding what data they're comfortable sharing, and suggesting exactly how that data should be used in these diversity-aware services. The idea is the platform has to be co-created with the community it serves to ensure it genuinely reflects the diverse nature of that community and respects their boundaries.
That participatory element sounds crucial. But what are the biggest ethical stumbling blocks you see in trying to quantify and leverage human diversity like this, even with good intentions?
Well, the most critical ethical challenge, I think, is that the very act of quantifying diversity risks introducing these static kind of flat categories that inevitably fail to capture the full nuance of human identity and experience, especially concerning sensitive issues like, say, gender identity or minority cultural practices that don't fit neatly into predefined boxes.
Right. You try to measure something complex, you inevitably simplify it.
You do. And the major risk that emerges from that is what they call the threat of invisibility. If the dominant social practices within that community, maybe the practices of the majority group, end up dictating what data gets captured and prioritized.
And minority practices get ignored.
Exactly. Minority practices that deviate from the norm might not be adequately registered by the system, or they might not be promoted by the algorithm when matches are made. So the system has to constantly actively guard against merely reflecting, or worse, actually amplifying pre-existing societal biases. Biases that might exclude people or practices that don't fit easily into the measurable categories the system uses. It's a constant balancing act. Hashtag 3.2 platform responsibilities and algorithmic interventions.
Okay, so moving from these more conceptual frameworks like WeNet back to the immediate actions that platforms operating right now could take.
Yeah.
That Stanford report you mentioned earlier outlines some pretty clear responsibilities for them. What's the fundamental algorithmic shift they say is required to move away from just maximizing screen time?
The primary recommendation, really the core one, is a fundamental shift in how their algorithms are designed and what they optimize for. They need to move towards maximizing content quality over purely raw engagement metrics like clicks, likes, or time spent watching.
Quality over quantity of engagement.
Right. This means actively addressing the upstream causes of why harmful content spreads so easily. Recognizing that algorithmic promotion, especially when it's driven by ranking approaches, centered entirely around maximizing any kind of engagement, is often the root cause of that manufactured anger phenomenon you described right at the start.
Okay, so if the goal is shifting to quality, what are the actionable strategies? What can platforms actually do right now to enforce this shift?
Well, the report outlines several. Firstly, platforms really need to implement what they call youth interests first designs.
Okay, what does that look like?
These are features specifically designed to facilitate self-reflection and self-regulation, especially for younger users who are still developing these skills. Examples could be things like periodic reminders popping up, asking about their goals for using the app, or reminding them of community rules, or maybe having certain restrictive features like, say, private messaging between adult strangers and minor users set to off by default rather than opt-out. The whole design philosophy should encourage intentional, valuable usage rather than just passive, endless consumption. Secondly, there's the concept of virality dampening.
Dampening virality, slowing things down.
Essentially, yes, systematically reducing the speed and the reach of potentially harmful content. So if an algorithm detects content that seems highly polarized, maybe emotionally distressing, or has markers associated with misinformation, it should automatically slow down its spread. By not pushing it aggressively into recommendation feeds, for example. This allows time for human review or for context to be added before it potentially reaches a massive audience and causes harm.
That makes sense, but it also sounds like the constant trade-off we keep bumping into, doesn't it? If platforms start dampening the spread of anger or misinformation, couldn't they also inadvertently dampen the spread of beneficial content? Things like social movements or important political activism often rely on going viral to achieve critical mass. How do they possibly navigate that complexity?
It requires extremely careful calibration and, crucially, transparency about how it's being done. It's not easy. The intervention needs to be surgical enough, hopefully, to curtail things like hate speech, dangerous misinformation, or coordinated harassment campaigns, while still safeguarding beneficial content that might be controversial, might be challenging, but is necessary for social progress or democratic debate.
It's a tough line to walk.
It's an ongoing technical and ethical challenge, absolutely. But the argument is that the default settings shouldn't be maximum speed for everything. The default should lean towards safety, especially when potential harm is detected. And finally, a third key area is that platforms simply must prioritize transparency and controls to give users back a sense of agency.
More control for the user.
Yes. This means offering highly customizable content controls, letting people filter out or reduce their exposure to types of material they find harmful or just don't want to see, making it much easier to toggle specific platform features like autoplay or certain types of notifications on or off. Basically, users need tools to manage their own experiences, to self-remediate to some extent. They shouldn't feel trapped or constantly manipulated by the default settings designed to maximize engagement, #tag 3.3 policy, and regulatory roadmaps.
Okay, so platform design shifts, user controls, these are all essential pieces. But history kind of shows us that relying purely on voluntary industry change is often, well, insufficient, especially when addressing systemic public health risks like addiction or widespread mental health impacts. So what's the role for policymakers, for regulators? How can they help force this global shift towards digital well-being?
Yeah, the role of policy is seen as critical by most experts in this field. One major recommendation is for policymakers to work towards establishing consistent, ideally global standards for safety measures, focusing particularly on youth-specific guidelines. This could include standardized rules for things like age-appropriate content moderation, robust data privacy protections for minors, and maybe even mandating certain safe-by-design features we discussed.
Why global?
Because these platforms operate globally. Inconsistent regulation across different countries often just leads to loopholes or a race to the bottom in terms of safety standards. And crucially, policymakers need to address that massive information asymmetry we talked about earlier between the platforms and everyone else.
Right. They know how it works, we don't.
Exactly. So there's a very strong, consistent push from researchers and public health advocates for policymakers to enforce requirements that platforms provide meaningful data access. Access for regulators, yes, but also, critically, for vetted independent researchers operating under strict ethical protocols. And the purpose of this data access is very specific. First, to accurately measure the prevalence of those specific harms we defined earlier, like anxiety resulting from social comparison. And second, maybe most importantly, to measure the impact of any mitigation strategies the platforms claim they're implementing.
To see if they actually work.
Precisely. Without this kind of intervention data, we're all just operating in the dark. We can't properly assess what platform changes actually make a difference and which ones are just, safety washing.
And this brings us right back full circle to that legal framework we discussed in Section 1, the potential power of regulating things that are content neutral.
Exactly. Policymakers are being strongly advised by legal scholars and public health experts to really lean into the value of regulating those content-neutral, addictive design features. This strategy, the one we called neutrality triangulation, it creates that crucial safe harbor for public health regulation that might otherwise get bogged down in First Amendment battles. By challenging platform conduct that is content neutral, like the specific timing used to stagger notifications for a variable reward effect, or the deployment of infinite scroll purely to maximize session time, regulators can address the compulsive architecture.
Without getting directly into the weeds of moderating specific pieces of content.
Right. Which, as platforms constantly remind us, is often protected by Section 230 and the First Amendment. So regulating the neutral design features is seen as potentially the path of least legal resistance, but with potentially the highest public health impact in terms of reducing compulsion. So the final conclusion, really, from the experts looking at policy, is that the path forward requires carefully addressing this inherent tension, the tension between privacy, free speech, and safety all at the same time. Any regulatory measures have to be really carefully calibrated. They need to ensure they don't disproportionately harm marginalized groups who often rely on these platforms for community and voice. And they shouldn't unduly limit access to beneficial content either. For example, some experts did note the risk of, say, over-limiting child access to important health information online, which they ranked as a lower severity harm compared to CSIM, but still a relevant concern. So the policies ultimately have to support the digital well-being of all users without unnecessarily restricting their ability to find information, express themselves, or connect authentically online. It's a complex balance.
Okay, wow. This entire deep dive has really taken us on quite a journey, hasn't it? From that memory of the quiet, kind of open, conversational corner of the 2006 web, all the way to this deliberately manipulative architecture of the modern attention economy. An economy seemingly built on attention capture designs and often the continuous farming of outrage and reaction. We've pretty clearly established, I think, that the current market often rewards platforms for making the most addictive products possible, while they use powerful legal shields to protect those very systems of compulsion.
But, and this is the crucial but, the landscape is shifting. It's not static. We have increasingly robust legal arguments and design frameworks emerging, things like the digital well-being lens, the strategy of neutrality triangulation, the integrated harm framework for defining problems. These are tools that are beginning to force platforms and designers, and maybe even regulators, to start prioritizing user autonomy and well-being more seriously. And maybe just as crucially, we have these incredibly powerful grassroots movements like the community content creators in India we highlighted. They prove undeniably that authenticity, that community purpose, that solution-driven content, it can thrive. It can achieve real, measurable impact. It can grow exponentially entirely outside of that viral anger machine. These success stories are the vital proof we need that a better digital future isn't just some fuzzy aspiration, it's actually achievable.
So the ultimate goal here, it seems, isn't merely about mitigating the harms of the current system, though that's urgently needed. It's about fundamentally altering the economic incentive structure itself, ensuring that innovation online gets rewarded not just for maximizing screen time with the most addictive product, but for designing the highest quality products that genuinely enhance human autonomy and well-being. This shift feels absolutely essential if we want to sustain a vibrant, competitive digital market that truly serves people, not just exploits their attention.